Ni hao, and welcome to episode 11 of my vlog about Mao's China. And this time we're thinking about how the Cultural Revolution winds down from 1968 onwards, and to what extent it was finished before Mao's death in 1976. So remember that the Cultural Revolution had been brewing from 1962 to 1966 as Mao became more and more frustrated with being sidelined within his own party and within his own country. He had taken a step back because of the debacle of the Great Leap Forward and the famine, but he talks at one point of being treated as if he was dead by successors like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who were running China in quite a different way than Mao had envisaged. And Mao becomes concerned that the bureaucrats and the politicians of China in the mid 60s had forgotten how revolutionary the Communist Party was meant to be, and that young people had not experienced the revolution of 1949, the political revolution. And so he develops this idea of a cultural revolution, a revolution kind of the inside of the country, or the inside of the country, as opposed to kind of the external part of the country. So that's where the Cultural Revolution idea stemmed from, and it's either to restore the ideology of communism or to restore Mao as a political identity, or perhaps both of those things together, because in Mao's head, they have to come together, that he is the only one who can bring China back to the communism that it's meant to be focusing on. And that started by him and Lin Biao and, to an extent, Jiang Qing whipping up students of China into the Red Terror by forming the Red Guards and sending them out to destroy the Four Olds. And remember that when they did that, they didn't define what the Four Olds were any further than giving them headings. They allowed them to go out and kind of define what that should look like for themselves. And that creates all sorts of damage and dislocation and terror for the population of China. Through 1966 and into early 1967. By the start of 1967, Red Guard factions are actually competing with each other and fighting against each other to, in essence, to prove themselves that the most communist of groups. And the best example of that is called the January Storm in 1967 in Shanghai, where different factions of Red Guards fought to the extent that Mao himself actually intervened and set up what was called the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee to run to run Shanghai, and to take control out of the hands of these Red Guards. And the Revolutionary Committee consisted of some revolutionaries, but also Communist Party officials and PLA members. The PLA actually were growing increasingly concerned that the Cultural Revolution might be turned on them themselves. And so in February, they, supported by the Politburo, began to try and crack down upon the Red Guards and regain control of parts of China. However, initially, certainly through the spring of 1967, Mao is on the side of the Red Guards in this struggle. He says to the Red Guards in April, "Have no fear of chaos. The more chaos you dish out, the better. Chaos and disorder are always good things." And inevitably, this sort of leadership from Mao led to fights between the Red Guards and the PLA. The biggest of those was in Wuhan, in southern China, where the PLA arrested 500 Red Guards and then killed 1,000 protesters. China was devolving into anarchy through 1967. One of the victims of that period of time was Wang Guangmei, who was Liu Shaoqi's wife. Wang is Wang. You can refer to her as Liu's wife. She was forced to appear in public in a fashionable dress, high heels, and a necklace made of ping pong balls to represent the necklace made of pearls that she had worn in a state visit to Indonesia, where she was seen as having represented a sort of too bourgeois a view of China. Wearing this outfit of capitalism and imperialism, she was paraded in front of 300,000 Red Guards and sentenced to solitary confinement in prison. She was released in 1979, but only after serving 12 years in that prison. By August 1967, Mao was becoming concerned about the integrity of the PLA and perhaps of the chaos that was ensuing across China. So he did authorise the PLA to crack down on radical groups when it needed to. And this was really a turning point in regaining control of China, or politically regaining control of China. Red Guards protested to Mao that a black hand was trying to suppress them. And Mao actually famously said, "I am the black hand." So 1968 then is this then is the argument that the PLA are the ones that restore order at after the Cultural Revolution or during the Cultural Revolution, because they are the ones that take the initiative to act against the Red Guards and kind of force Mao's hand to back them in 1967. In 1968, there was a campaign launched called Cleansing the Class Ranks, and this actually was a centralization of the Cultural Revolution. Remember, at the start, it's put in the hands of the Red Guards, and they're not really given many instructions. They're just left to go and get on with it. But here in 1968, the Central Cultural Revolution Group developed this Cleansing the Class Ranks campaign, and that campaign is carried out by the PLA. So the Red Guards are now frozen out of the Cultural Revolution. Committees were set up all over the country with the aim of eradicating all signs of capitalism. It led to 100,000 more people being killed, 1.8 million people being arrested, most of these in rural areas. So this is, again, it's a development of the Cultural Revolution. In 1966 and 1967, been mostly urban, as the Red Guards had carried it forward. From 1968, the PLA are now carrying the Cultural Revolution forward, and now it's spreading into rural areas. Having already moved against Liu Shaoqi's wife in 1967, in October 1968, Jiang Qing brought forward evidence of Liu Shaoqi's treachery to the Central Committee. She had interrogated 28,000 people to get this evidence, and Liu was denounced as a renegade, a scab, and a traitor. He was put in prison and kept in solitary confinement, and actually ended up dying in 1969. So he is the most high-profile victim of the Cultural Revolution. By the end of 1968, there were 29 provincial committees in place. The last Red Guard units had been disbanded, their newspapers closed down. And in December 1968, the Up to the Mountains, Down to the Villages campaign was instigated. 18 million Red Guards were sent to cool off in remote areas. Their exile was permanent for most of them and very unwelcome for both them and the rural population which had to welcome them, many of whom were struggling to feed themselves and their families, and now had somebody else or other people coming to live in their village who knew nothing about agriculture and not much about hard manual labour either. This then, in 1968, represents the end of the Cultural Revolution in the phase that it is most famous for and its most anarchic phase. The Red Guards are disbanded and the young people are dispersed. But, let's do the and first. In 1969, Mao is seen to be politically triumphant. In April 1969, the 9th Communist Party conference happens, and representatives at that party congress represented the Cultural Revolution. Many of them were from revolutionary committees. More than a quarter were PLA members. Maoism was accepted as the official guiding ideology of the Communist Party. A new Politburo was elected. Chen Yoda was promoted, as were Kang Shen and Lin Biao. Lin Biao was actually elected to being Mao's closest comrade in arms. Zhou Enlai remained in the Politburo, but he was demoted. Of course, Liu Shaoqi was in prison at that time, and Deng Xiaoping had been removed as well. The Congress declared in 1969 that the Cultural Revolution was over. And as I've said, in November of 1969, Liu Shaoqi died. So Mao was now back in power, and the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore of the People's Republic of China, were Maoist. And so that's kind of a sign of the triumph of Mao in the Cultural Revolution. But you could argue that the Cultural Revolution carries on in terms of the struggle for who's going to be in power alongside Mao. Who is Mao's closest allies, which faction is going to be in charge. In April 1970, so a year after the party congress, the plenum of the Ninth Party Congress, kind of a regathering to see how things are going. By that stage, it was clear that a split had developed between the promoters of the Cultural Revolution. Chen, who was a supporter of Lin and therefore the PLA faction, got into an argument with a guy called Zhang Chongzhao, supported by Jiang Qing, a member of the Gang of Four, part of the sort of more ideological, radical end of the Cultural Revolution. Mao took the side of Jiang and his wife, demoted Chen, and warned the PLA about their political positions, perhaps feeling that Lin Biao was getting a bit big for his boots and using tensions with the Soviet Union, which were rumbling on around the late 60s, to promote his own position. And in fact, I mean, the PLA had seized the initiative the couple of years before that as well. This all leads up to the mysterious death in September 1971 of Lin Biao. PLA influence had already kind of peaked and declined by that stage. Officially, Lin Biao's death was because his son had planned a coup, and Mao was warned about an attempt to assassinate him, and Lin Biao was caught up in that plot. Lin got in a plane and tried to leave the country, but his plane crashed in Mongolia. We don't really know how true all this is, whether Lin Biao was really plotting against Mao or whether that was made up afterwards, whether he was flying because he'd been accused of it or actually had done it. We've no idea. The Central Committee didn't even admit his death for 2 months because actually either way, it was hard to explain how Mao's closest comrade in arms had turned out to be a traitor who was plotting against him. Nevertheless, this is the end, really, of the PLA's involvement and in the story of the Cultural Revolution. And it leads on to the third and final phase of struggle between those radicals who want the Cultural Revolution to follow the Gang of Four, who want the Cultural Revolution to follow that radical Maoist policies, and the moderates who are now kind of starting to emerge from their caves and under their shells, out of their shells, to try and reassert some sense of moderate policy. Initially, it looks like the radicals are going to have more of a say in the future of China. Wang Hongwen, the fourth member of the Gang of Four, was made vice chairman of the Communist Party in September 1972. But less than 6 months later, in March 1973, Deng Xiaoping was made vice premier of the People's Republic of China because Mao wanted to use Deng Xiaoping as a counterweight to Gang of Four's influence. He saw him as a competent administrator. He didn't want the Cultural Revolution to end in the ruin of the PRC, and the anarchy that had happened at the time was not a good sign of that. Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping were therefore in control of most of the government by the early 70s, but the Gang of Four were controlling most of the media and the propaganda networks. In 1973, the economy of China was still in a bad place because ideology at that time was being put ahead of profit and efficiency. And so Zhou Enlai, as a moderate, tried to reverse that and was criticised by Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four in a campaign called Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius, who is kind of the founder of Confucianism, obviously, which is a wisdom literature that most Chinese people have embedded in them, and a kind of sort of religious path that a lot of Chinese people followed in those days. This was a subtle attempt at criticising Zhou Enlai himself and the moderates that were backing him, and a sign of how the Gang of Four and the moderates were competing with each other. In 1975, Zhou Enlai had to withdraw from government because he had cancer, and so Deng Xiaoping became PLA Chief of Staff, Vice Chairman of the Communist Party, and Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and using that power, he began to restructure the economy. However, at a point where it seems like the moderates are regaining control. In November 1975, Mao forced Deng Xiaoping to self-criticize his economic reforms for taking the capitalist road. This is 1962 all over again. So into 1976, Zhou Enlai died in January of bladder cancer. By that time, Mao was too unwell himself to even attend his funeral. Hua Guofeng was made premier, replacing Zhou Enlai, rather than Deng Xiaoping or a member of the Gang of Four. Hua Guofeng was seen as someone who was neutral and in the middle. The Gang of Four tried to control the reaction to Zhou Enlai's death and suppress support for him and his achievements. I remember they're in charge of kind of media and propaganda type stuff. But popular discontent was growing against them. And this leads in April 1976 to the Tiananmen incident, where on the eve of the Qingming festival, which was a traditional day of mourning in China, a traditional day of mourning. Remember, this is one of the four ols, the four cultures and habits that Chinese people were meant to have rejected. Up to 2 million people visited Tiananmen Square to commemorate Zhou Enlai and to criticize the Cultural Revolution. There was an attempt to suppress this on the 6th of April. That led to riots for which Deng Xiaoping was blamed. He was stripped of his positions and seemed to be out of the picture. In September 1976, Mao Zedong died and Hua Guofeng took over. Hua Guofeng was backed by the PLA and reformers, but on the 6th of October, the Gang of Four were arrested, and Hua Guofeng restored Deng Xiaoping to being vice premier in July 1977. The final triumph, really, of the moderate reformers as opposed to the hardline communists. So, just going back to our two questions that we looked at the start really briefly. To what extent was the PLA responsible for the gradual restoration of order from 1968? Well, it was. It took the initiative. It was worried about becoming the next target of the Cultural Revolution. And so it began to fight against the Red Guards. And then in the summer of 1968, partly because there were concerns about a threat from the Soviet Union, which Mao knew that he might need the PLA to face down. Mao had got on board with the PLA and said, yes, you can stamp down on the Red Guards. So yes, the PLA is physically responsible for that restoration of order. But I would argue that Mao, it only worked because Mao got behind it. Whereas in the spring of 1968, there's a lot of unrest and tension and violence between the PLA and the Red Guards. It's hard to see that could have been done without Mao. However, it's also hard to see that the Red Guards could have overwhelmed the PLA. So there would have been more anarchy for longer if Mao hadn't intervened, would be my conclusion there. And to what extent was the Cultural Revolution brought to an end in the years before Mao's death in 1976? Well, I would say yes. And the violence was brought under control for sure. And the anarchy at a national level across the nation was brought under control by 1976. If you were an average Chinese person living in any place in China, probably you would say that the Cultural Revolution had ended and that normality was being restored. But the political infighting that you might see as being the key trait of the Cultural Revolution definitely continues. It shifts from being between Mao and the reformers to being between the Gang of Four and the PLA, and then between the Gang of Four and what I've called the moderates after that. So it kind of shifts between factions, but that kind of political competition to be top dog, if you see that as being the central aspect of the Cultural Revolution, then it definitely continues through to 1976. That was longer than I was expecting, but hopefully it was useful. And next time we'll move on to the final section of the Mao's China topic, which is looking at social change during Mao's reign. Thanks for watching. See you next time.